You're listening to Testing Wrestling, episode number 20. Is this 25? Are we there? Are we at 25? It's
numbers are meaningless.
I think 24? 20. No. Well, no. We're past, you know what?
Doesn't matter.
I think we're 26, actually.
You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, episode number, the episode that this is the number of. And that's for you to know and for us to not have looked up before we started recording. This is a podcast where I am somebody who, my name is Evan Burke. I'm not just, I have a name.
For now.
I'm somebody who doesn't normally care for wrestling. For now, I do. Who knows what our response to the coronavirus panic is going to be like. We're recording this on April 1st, so, sorry if that joke is horrible in retrospect, 6 weeks afterwards or whenever the hell this is going to come out. I am somebody who does not care for wrestling normally, and I have 3 incredibly close friends who not only love wrestling but have dedicated huge amounts of their lives to wrestling, either in a professional capacity or just a fan capacity or some combination of the two. And this is about me going on a journey, them leading me on a journey in a sort of a fellowship of the ring situation where the goal is to cast my dislike for wrestling into the fires of Mount Doom, which in this metaphor is like the good wrestling.
Yeah, that. Whatever he just said.
A bit of a strained metaphor, but okay.
Well put, Evan. Well put.
Look, I have not left the house in a long time at this point.
You've been catching up on Tolkien, though, rereading those books.
The last time I tried to reread them, there's a lot of descriptions of the scenery. I don't know. There's a lot of fantasy.
Honestly, I was never really able to get into them.
I loved them as a child, but
fantasy has always been a little bit hard for me to get into, with the exception of like the Rothfuss books and a couple other things like that. The Game of Thrones books, I haven't really been able to do it.
It's too it's not refined enough for Ben's Professor Butthole.
Exactly. Only science fiction fits in my Professor Butthole when it comes to the genres.
I would say you should try reading. There's a lot of great fantasy out there, but N.K. Jemisin, who is the first author ever to win 3 Hugos in a row for the same trilogy. Also is the first black woman to win the Hugo Award, I believe it all. The Broken Earth trilogy is like as good as anything you'll read ever.
There's also, I lent you those books. The name of the author is escaping me right now.
Yes, I still have not. Laura read them. I have not read them yet. Laura read them. I should read them. They're on my shelf. I look at them every day and think about how I haven't read them yet.
Megan Whalen Turner. All right, so today
we're on the docket for
you all
today.
should introduce.
We are
y'all
on
should
the docket.
Introduce yourselves, and then I'll describe what we're doing.
Oh yeah, Doc, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right. Well, my name is Doc Diamondfire. I've been involved in professional wrestling for about 11 years. I really have to get a start date on this. Sometime around there as a wrestler, an announcer, a commentator, and these days a podcaster more than anything else, especially since all the wrestling shows have been canceled, except WrestleMania. Katie?
I'm Katie, a.k.a. Katie Vella, a.k.a. Ref Katie. I am a professional referee. I've been in the wrestling business since 2014. I've been a fan of wrestling since 2003, the worst year to become a fan of wrestling. And that's about that. I like butts.
It's all uphill from there.
I think like 2007 is probably the worst year to become a fan of pro wrestling.
2003, though, was Triple H's Reign of Terror.
Okay. Oh, I was watching SmackDown mostly.
SmackDown was great in 2003.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And who are you, Professor?
I am Dr. Ben Abelson, professor of philosophy at Mercy College, and been watching wrestling since 1992, with only brief periods where I was not, mostly in high school.
I think Triple H's name should be pronounced. That's what I have to add to this conversation.
Yeah, I don't think they've really tried that, but I'd like to see someone pull it off consistently.
Yeah. That's good, like Beavis, like Butthead.
I bet you Truth could pull it off. I bet you Truth could be like, yo, it's... and people would get it.
This week, by now it's already happened. They're doing this like fantasy WrestleMania thing with the video game where they're having wrestlers commentate over these fantasy matchups played in the video game. And Drake Maverick and R-Truth are doing John Cena versus Hulk Hogan. I kind of want to see that.
Oh, that's great.
That's pretty good.
Anyway, today we are beginning our mega series on the great Mick Foley. I believe like one of the greatest, if not the greatest, minds in the history of pro wrestling, creative powers. And this, we're focusing on the earliest part of his career when he was Cactus Jack. First in WCW, then in Japan, as well as ECW.
Now, before we get into anything, I do just want to say, Doc, I noticed, and I'm sure that nobody has ever observed this before. I'm about to blow your mind. I think this is the first time you're ever going to hear this in your life.
What's up, Evan?
You bear somewhat of a resemblance to Mick Foley. Did you know this?
I do. It's true. It is. You are not the first to mention this.
I refuse to believe that, and I will not accept that statement as truth.
Yeah, I've always been a big fan. When I was a teenager, I made my own Mankind mask for Halloween and stuff. You know, I always wanted to be just like Mick Foley, minus the head trauma.
You have read.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I say that kind of lightheartedly. I'm serious, and I think, you know, Mick would agree that, like, of his best qualities and the best stuff that he did, allowing himself to get as beat up as he did is not among it. And he probably could have gotten away, even with his wild style, doing a bit less of the getting bludgeoned in the head.
And with these three matches, Evan can see why.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's especially that one with The Rock, which we'll get to, I think, next
we will.
episode.
Oh, boy. I know which one you mean.
Which was, yeah. But, Doc, when I first met you, besides wearing the red flannel and the actual Cactus Jack t-shirt or Mankind t-shirt fairly regularly, you also read his autobiographies many times.
I'm a big fan of his autobiographies, especially his first book, Have a Nice Day. I still have a copy that's kind of torn in half, just a paperback, because I read it so many times on my shelf.
I also picked up a copy of it recently at a couple years ago at a thrift store, remember?
Yeah, it's in much better condition.
Yeah.
I think I read that copy that you have
possibly
once as well. You lent it to me.
Well, it's a great book.
They're great books.
People thought he was crazy when he wanted to write his book himself instead of going through a ghostwriter. It's like they tried giving him a ghostwriter. And as he said, it's like when he said, how about I write it myself? They looked at him like you'd look at a guy who had had a dozen concussions, said, I'm about to write a book longhand. But he insisted he could do it, and he just started working on it hours every day. And in a couple of months, he had what would be like the best wrestling book written, especially at the time and for many years since, was obviously the best wrestling book.
Oh, they tried to recreate it so many times.
Yeah.
Of the ones I've read, it's still the best.
It is.
Far.
It's just straight up the best. Like, there's a couple other books that are, like, good, but not that good. Like, Flair's was good. Flair's autobiography was pretty good. Jericho's first book was good. Yeah.
The Jim Ross's new book.
Everybody else's books were ghostwritten, right? Whereas Foley actually wrote his.
Yeah, to be clear, having a book ghostwritten doesn't necessarily mean you had no input on it yourself.
No,
There's a wide range of ghostwritten books, just in general. At the low end, there's the writer talked to the subject for a few hours and then came up with a bunch of crap that doesn't have anything to do with it. But the best books that are ghostwritten simply have a writer to go with the author because the author is not a professional writer.
Yeah.
And they need to work with a writer to make the book cohesive. And if you read a lot of wrestling books, you can kind of tell which ones were more hands-on and which ones weren't.
Yeah, like Jericho had a ghostwriter, but I think it's still, he had a lot of input in.
Yeah,
he's written like 4 books by now.
And I did not mean that to be like, oh, like the guys who had ghostwriters, like, fuck them. More just, oh, wow, Mick Foley, in addition to everything else, also just, like, straight up wrote his own books.
And you can tell the heart in it when you read it, because it sounds like a guy is really telling you his life story. Like, I was a child on Long Island. You know, I liked wrestling. I hitchhiked to the Garden to see wrestling. I joined a wrestling school that I had to drive to. Man, this is a wild ride, you know?
He wrote it in composition notebooks, like while on tour.
Yeah.
Wrestling.
By hand, because he didn't type.
Yeah, that was back when some people didn't type.
Right.
Back when
He
that was an
types
option.
now.
Kids. Yeah. I mean, it's not like we're all typists. It's not like we actually know the skill of typing, but we all gotta fucking type anyway. There was a time, kids, when like you didn't have a computer.
Well, there was also
Sometimes.
and also there's the typing was formalized for many years, especially because for the century that we just had typewriters, you had to like do it in a really specific way, or else the thing would jam because they were really easy to break.
Right.
So the typing classes that existed up until the late 90s were all still based on this typewriter technique that was developed in like the 1800s.
Yeah, you also learned how to sit and how to hold your hand so you don't get the plethora of injuries everybody
Yes.
in our generation has by never
Yup.
training to type but still typing for years.
Yeah.
I don't have them because I listen during typing class and type that way. And I type 100 words a minute, guys.
Katie
You know-
types 100 words a minute. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous to watch.
That's incredible. You know,
Yeah, and we have there's a loud keyboard that it's great.
it is
Yeah,
amazing.
and you know what? I don't have any of those injuries.
Nope.
It is amazing how much like we don't know how to do things like sit, or at least like we don't know how to do that without hurting ourselves. I don't know. I might definitely something I have learned, like starting to actually care about fitness over the last few years of my life, is just like being shocked at how little I understand how my own body works. Like I don't know what to do with my butt. You know what I mean? I don't know when to engage the butt muscles.
Yeah.
When to I've had to learn how to use my own butt, and that feels weird that I was almost 40 when that happened.
You know, when I started doing DDP yoga, like DDP yells at you constantly to squeeze your glutes. And once I started doing that, I was like, God, if someone had told me to squeeze my glutes much earlier in my life, I would be so much happier and healthier.
Yeah.
So
it's
many
the
ways.
bottom of the chain there, you know, you need it.
Speaking of bodies hurting, what's our first match on the docket for Mick Foley?
Oh, well, we are starting with the real zinger from WCW in 1993.
Halloween Havoc.
Halloween Havoc. Mick Foley as Cactus Jack versus Big Van Vader, and
In a
Oh,
Texas
boy.
death match.
Oh boy.
with Harley Race on the outside.
Can I give you guys my just meta feelings about Foley?
Yeah.
Oh,
Before
it's about
we
you,
get
Ed.
into the whole thing. So I have not felt this conflicted about a wrestler so far. And the conflict really comes from, so I am 100% behind him as a performer in every regard. Like the promos especially fucking incredible. I can tell that it was really revolutionary at the time. I can tell that he embodies these characters really well, all this stuff. I didn't enjoy these matches, and not just because like they were like brutal or whatever. I will say I found these matches profoundly boring, while simultaneously finding Foley himself very interesting.
You know, I kind of thought you weren't going to be the biggest fan of these matches. They're brawls, so there's not a lot of fancy moves. There's not a lot of technique, and so far you've shown yourself to like fine technique over most other things.
I do want
to that I'll say, don't worry, we will watch him wrestle Shawn Michaels before long.
and I do want to
just
say
hang in there.
I don't think, or at least I hope I'm not becoming like a technique snob in wrestling or anything like that. I like to think that I might be able to enjoy something that's not just technical or high flying or whatever. But yeah, I get like I don't really like two guys just like taking turns beating the shit out of each other. I guess I will say I don't find that compelling. I guess maybe that makes me a snob. I don't know.
I don't think it makes you a snob. I think you're, for better or for worse, you're developing a taste in wrestling. It's the same thing, once again, as any other art form. You might like action movies, but not like romantic comedies. You might like romantic comedies, but not like action movies. It's kind of the same thing with genres of wrestling. Now, these matches, I kind of like to think of them as like Mick Foley's like punk club days, where before... first of all, before he was working, in some cases, with a higher level of pressure on him, even though these are main event matches, they're not like that, It's not like main eventing WrestleMania or anything. And it was, his first character, which had mostly been done through guts and the willingness to put himself through hell, as opposed to putting on the greatest match that he could.
I mean, there's different kinds of pressure. Like, for example, in the King of the Death match that we're going to get to, the pressure was to have the most insanely brutal match on the card after a whole tournament of death matches. But I think in general, to your point, Doc, this is an experimental period for Cactus Jack. And he hadn't really mastered the storytelling that he would be able to utilize later on in his career.
It does kind of have a similar flavor to going and seeing like some harsh experimental music at an underground club somewhere, especially in the sense of sometimes you go see really harsh grinding experimental stuff and it's really cool if somebody like has figured out how to do it well. And then sometimes it makes you ask the question that I kind of asked watching these matches, which is like, why are you doing this? Like, what's the end? What's your personal end game here? Because I mean, wrestling in general, you look at it and you're like, oh my god, it's so risky. Is this what you're risking your life for? And it's fine, but there's, at least in these early days with Foley, I know he went on to go do progressively more interesting stuff, but in the early days, I'm like, I feel like if I went and saw my friend Mick Foley do this in 1993, I would be like, dude, like, what do you... Why is this what you need to do with yourself? And, that's a lot of art. A lot of artists is just like, look, this is what I have to do. I'm sorry, this is the way that I have to make art. I am driven by this. I don't fully understand these forces myself. But it's just like, yeah.
I mean, he wanted to be a wrestler. He wanted to be a wrestling star. He didn't look particularly like a wrestling star, especially for the time. But he had this body that was very well equipped to take bumps. He has a giant ass.
He does have a big,
giant
juicy
flat ass, I might add.
Yeah, giant flat ass, right. And he, I think he started taking the crazy bumps. And from what I remember from the autobiography, and they got these incredible reactions from the crowd. And he was like, all right, well, I guess this is what's going to get me over. And I think he always liked the more sort of high risk kind of thing. He famously attended a show at Madison Square Garden where Jimmy Superfly Snuka jumped off of the cage onto Don Morocco. And when he saw that, that's what made him want to be a wrestler. And then he did some of like the first documented backyard wrestling, where he was jumping off the roof of his house onto mattresses and things like that. And so that was already sort of in his style. But I think, he got a lot of reinforcement for that kind of behavior. And it just kind of snowballed from there.
I do have a couple thoughts on what Evan was saying about, like, why would anyone want to see him do this? Are we showing him the match at any point where his family's in the audience?
Yeah, that's the one with the Rock. Yeah.
Well, then we'll get to that because that's the thing.
I do want to point out my question is not why would anyone want to see him do this. That I actually completely understand. My question is why would anybody they themselves choose to do this?
I think those two questions are intertwined.
Yes.
So about the first match, like, I don't know, Evan, did you understand the rules? Because I feel like if you have to repeat the rules of a match every 5 minutes, there's too many rules.
Oh, that was TNA levels
Yeah.
of
Yes.
convoluted
No,
rules.
the first thing I have was these rules seem complicated, and I kept forgetting what was happening and what stage of the match we were at, and like
So these are the rules. These are the rules as they described them.
Repeatedly.
No disqualification. Pinfalls don't count. But there is a 30-second rest period after a pinfall, and someone loses when they can't answer a 10 count.
And they
Now,
only,
as described, this makes no sense whatsoever.
to describe that a little simpler is you have to score a pinfall, and then there's a 30-second rest period, and then there's a 10-second period where the person who got pinned has to get up. Now, I don't know why they don't just make it a 40 count
Yeah,
for
exactly.
the person
Right,
that needs to
yeah.
get up, other than the fact that that's ludicrous.
Well, the reason why it can't be that fed into the finish, which was incredibly ludicrous. It was
Yeah.
like a loophole within the stupid fucking... Yeah, first of all, a 40 count is ridiculous. But then in the finish, Vader hits a DDT on Foley on the chair and pins him on Cactus Jack. Cactus Jack gets up before the rest period is over, before the 30 seconds are over, and DDTs Vader, and then they're both down when they get to the end of the rest period. So even though Cactus Jack got up, he was back down again by the time the rest period ended. So then the ref counted to 10 for both of them for some reason. No, actually not for both of them. Then the ref counted to 10, and even though Jack did get up before the 10, Vader was distracting the ref. Harley Race hit Cactus Jack with the taser. He fell down again, so then when the ref turned around and counted 10, Jack was down and lost the match.
My headcanon on that finish is Nick Patrick was just tired of this shit.
Nick Patrick was confused the whole match. Did you see where he set up the table for them? Because they set it up the really dangerous way with the legs sticking out, and he's like, oh, this isn't good, and he turned it around.
If Nick Patrick, one of the best referees of the entire 80s and 90s, is confused, then you've got a match with too many rules.
the whole
Our
match.
commentator team of Tony Schiavone and Jesse Ventura also quite confused. Jesse was just kind of making fun of it the whole time.
You know who was confused? It was Mick Foley after that bump. Did you find the bump of the match that we're talking about, Evan?
There were a bunch of times when it looked like he actually hurt himself in a way that nobody was intending to.
Are you talking about the sunset flip?
No, I'm thinking of when he was on Vader's back, and then
Oh,
Vader
that
just
one.
jumped back with all his weight on him on the ramp.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah, on
that
the hardwood
sounded
ramp.
horrible.
Yeah. That's like a notoriously famous Foley bump.
Yeah, no, that you could feel how bad that was.
For how violent it was, the match had there was just very low energy. This was
Yeah.
it really was this plodding, I don't know. Vader doesn't seem that much of a character. I wrote Vader seems nice.
Oh, Vader's the best.
Vader's awesome.
Vader's the
This isn't
fucking
what
I
best,
would
I'm
argue
man.
that Vader
Yeah,
is
this
not
is
the
not
best.
a good
He's
representation.
one of the greatest
Vader.
monsters in wrestling history.
Well, in this
th-
match, I found him to be very boring to watch, and I didn't. Am I nuts? Did this is? I feel like this had a really slow energy. Am I nuts?
You're absolutely right, and it was because of the stupid rules of the match, I think.
Yes.
I don't know. I picked this because it was kind of the blow-off of the feud, but there were much better Cactus Jack Vader matches. They feuded for a while. Their matches were always extremely violent and, and really intense. The lead up to this match was Vader power bombing Cactus Jack on the concrete floor, putting him out for months. They did this whole ridiculous memory loss angle that Cactus references in the promo I had you guys watch.
Oh, that promo was great, by the way. Can we talk for a minute about the promo
Yeah.
before the match? Mick Foley has more intensity in his promos then than anybody on Raw's had for the last 5 years. And I mean, everyone combined. It makes you, I don't know, it makes you feel that this is a real guy and that he has intentions, as opposed to, a cardboard cutout reading lines into the camera.
He's also way more eloquent than just about anybody who's given promos ever.
I noticed right away his promos sound like written and rehearsed in the best possible way of meaning that. Like not like they sound just like flawlessly executed, and like his timing is amazing. Like everything is. What exactly is Cactus Jack's character?
Well, he's one of these guys who's just this character. Like, I mean, it's not a gimmick that you can really describe in a short sentence. He's a wild man from somewhere,
Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, they announced, even though he has a thick Long Island accent when he's talking.
Yeah. Who, doesn't care what happens to his body. And as they talk about it over and over again, enjoys pain and things like that. That was pretty much the extent of it.
Early in his career, he liked to say the line, which he blatantly stole from Ernie Ladd, I believe. I'd rather hurt a man than love a woman, which is there's some certain poetry about that. And like that kind of encapsulates the Cactus Jack character. He really Mick Foley never enjoyed the pain, but Cactus Jack loved it.
I do love when we watch a match and then I'm like, I wasn't nuts about this match. And then you guys are like, oh, well, like they had way better matches than this. And then I'm just like, oh, if only we had watched those matches.
Well, once again, the idea isn't necessarily to impress you, but to give you a full, to give you the reality of the situation.
You can impress me sometimes.
Well, we do impress you sometimes.
What I like about this match, instructively, is it shows you how Foley's style at the time just didn't fit into the WCW structure. And he really couldn't have the kinds of matches. After they did this match, they basically said that they weren't going to put Foley and Vader together in any more main events because it was so violent. But it was just, WCW wanted to do this big, silly, gimmicky thing when the thing to do with these guys was just to have them beat the shit out of each other. Eventually, they had a match in Germany. Probably their most famous match wasn't even televised.
Right, there's a grainy fan cam of the incident in question.
Yeah, Cactus Jack gets his head trapped in the ropes, which are a little bit harder than... he always did this, or he often did this spot where he would get his head tied up in the ropes. But these ropes were a little bit stronger and tighter than normal, so as he squeezed his head out of them, they ripped most of one of his ears off.
Ugh.
Yeah, so then he rolls back into the ring and keeps wrestling. And the grainy footage, he's taking working punches from Vader. And usually Vader just lays him in, as you may have noticed in this match. And you can see him, you can see Foley selling, throwing his head back like he's being punched. And you can see one of the times he throws his head back, most of his ear comes off the side of his head and flies away. Somebody finds it and they put it on ice. And they never fully reattached it. They saved the cartilage from it and implanted it on the side of his head, right below where his ear is supposed to be. So in theory, one day they could construct a new ear out of it. But to this day, he has one ear.
Yeah, I mean, at some point it just became a trademark.
Oh, yeah. Pretty quickly it became a trademark.
I don't know if you would have enjoyed any of their other matches more. This one was particular. The reason why I don't think this one was as good was because it had the stupid gimmick rules, which took away from it. But the other matches were pretty much, they did the same kinds of things. And I mean, if Vader doesn't impress you just as a physical presence who also can do a moonsault and who just clubbers their opponent in the corner and is just crazy intimidating in that way, then you're probably not going to like any of the other Vader stuff that much. I mean, we'll show you some more.
Vader's character, essentially, is he's supposed to be a monster that walked out of the Rocky Mountains. All right, who do I have to beat up to satiate my desire to beat someone up today? And everyone believed him because you believe a guy like that.
We'll probably show you his maybe one of his matches with Stan Hansen, which was a really wild brawl of the same sort, I guess, but they're famed for the time.
I mean, I'll give it another shot at some point. Maybe I wasn't in the right place for it or something.
But Foley just does some insane things in these matches. In this match in particular, I mentioned the sunset flip. Why the fuck do you do a sunset flip on Vader off of the apron to the floor? Cactus just slams on the fucking mat and then tries to pull him over, and then Vader just tries to sit on him. Just crazy shit. But one moment that's fucking awesome is when they fall into Vader's grave that's set up by the entrance ramp.
Yes,
and then
that was
Vader
great.
comes out of
that was
the
pretty good.
grave bleeding from the head and looks like a monster. I don't know. That's cool.
So does Foley in his books or anything? I mean, does he talk about like this match and then the next match? You know, does he talk about like where on a deep level his this, because it has to I feel like it has to come from somewhere. I feel like his disregard for his own safety and the degree to which he is willing to risk himself, like it's got to come from somewhere. Does he talk about that? Does he get that deep?
Yeah, he does talk about his like internal artistic, kind of thrust in his books. And I think we could all relate to it on some extent. He's the kind of guy who was always like the weird guy growing up. He was always always a good athlete when he tried to be, but he was always a little physically awkward. He wasn't very popular with the girls in school. He was the weird kid that was into wrestling, which was like really weird at the time where he was. And that's where it all comes from, this idea in his mind deeply that he doesn't belong, that he is somehow other than everyone else. And if they are going to treat him like a freak, well, damn it, he's going to act like a freak. He's like, you want to be freaked out? I'll freak you out. Check this out. And so he does these things. And as he grew up, and as he became an adult, he learned how to process this a lot better in his life. But as an artist, he still wants to draw from those feelings and emotions, which is what made him so effective as a character, even if some of his matches are plotting brawls.
And so, I was thinking of the Cactus Jack character as coming out of his in-ring style. But I guess it's the other way around. If you're going to have a character who's this crazy freak, well, he's going to have to do crazy freak shit. And a lot of that is going to be, diving off of shit that he shouldn't be diving off of. And he also just happened to have a high tolerance for pain, right? And so he could do it. And the audience already, I think before he was even doing it, was starting to demand more and more violent wrestling. ECW developed independently of Foley, which is why, and we'll get to this in a little bit, when they came together, it was just this kind of perfect marriage.
In my mind, from, just sort of what I have absorbed about Mick Foley over the years, his career is sort of is synonymous with the rise of this sort of hardcore style. Is that accurate? Or
yes.
Is that... Yeah, okay.
Yeah. He brought it to the mainstream.
He was the most prominent American hardcore wrestler for years.
I do just want to also make a quick correction. I do think all of that stuff about him and his artistic drive is interesting. I would not be able to relate to that, as I have been a level 60 Chad since I was 12. So I was not the weird guy at all in high school, and anyone who insinuates otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. But yes, just carry on. I do.
As you've said on previous episodes, you're a normal person as compared to us.
Yes, right. I am what's known as a normo amongst the normals, which is what we call ourselves. Don't look that up.
Before we get into the King of the Death match, there was one other spot. Not only does Foley do that crazy sunset flip thing, there's that other time where he does a flip over the barricade and just lands splats at Vader's feet. Like, he kind of makes contact, but Vader understandably no-sells it. Foley got a little bit smarter about his bumps as time went on, I think.
Sort of,
yes.
Eventually.
Well, eventually he stopped taking them.
But before that...
Yes, well before that.
August 15th, 1995. So, all right, so we actually didn't talk about it leading into this. We got to talk a little bit about Cactus Jack's problems with Eric Bischoff and WCW that led to his leaving the company. Because So the King of the Death match is actually the latest match we're talking about today. The Sabu match comes beforehand.
Oh, yeah, you want to do the Sabu match first then?
So maybe let's do that first. So,
Okay.
so the Sabu match happens when Cactus Jack is still with WCW. It's an interpromotional dream match, as they say, between ECW and WCW. It's from ECW Hostile City Showdown 94.
And this is still Eastern Championship Wrestling at this point, right?
Right, yes. Run by Paul E. Dangerously. Evan, you know who that is, right?
It took me a minute to figure out that it was a young Paul Heyman.
Okay, but
With his
good.
giant cell phone.
The backwards hat, always a great look.
Well, he was a yuppie. That was the character. Doc, do you remember the memory loss thing in more detail? Because I think that was part of the problem. Like, they set up this whole memory loss angle. In the promo, he denies it, right? In the promo, he's like, oh, it was all a ruse to trick Vader.
Here's what happened. Foley was already fairly disillusioned with his spot in WCW. They came up with an idea that Vader would put him out and they would do an amnesia angle with him. They said, we'll give you 12 weeks off and we'll pay you. And he's like, okay, I can stay at home with my family. And he had minor surgery done on his knee in the time to make sure they couldn't pull the plug on it after 2 weeks. The angle itself is grade A wrestle crap. It is some of the worst stuff that's ever happened.
I believe it is official wrestle crap by this point.
Oh, yeah. There was a series of vignettes called Lost in Cleveland where they had like almost a sitcom-esque reporter trying to find where Cactus Jack went, and they eventually find him like on a pirate ship with like he had shaved his beard and he was using pirate talk, and they brought in like a woman to play his wife and some people to play his kids, and he's like, I don't know who these people are. They were going to use his real wife, but they met his real wife and they're like, your real wife is too good looking to be your wife. We need to get a wife that would marry you.
Mick Foley's wife, by the way, is notoriously extremely
His daughter,
hot.
too.
She's a model, or she was a model.
Yes, she was a model.
And so they did about 8 weeks of these vignettes out of 12 before they pulled the plug on them because they were so awful. And then they brought Cactus back like, haha, I really can remember everything, and now I'm getting a title match for some reason.
And he's like, those weren't my real wife and kids.
Right.
You can see this in the promo. If you look on YouTube, it's August 28th, 1993. The promo on Vader. And note also the Smashing Pumpkins Siamese Dream poster.
I pointed that out too, yeah.
The problem with Bischoff was Bischoff, like so many others, just didn't see a guy like Cactus Jack being a long-term top investment. Plus, WCW had been going through a lot of turmoil over the years. They were losing a lot of money. Bischoff came in, and his main goal, and he said this a lot of times, is just to stop the company from losing money. He wanted to be able to report 1 penny in profit, because if he could do that, he could have some leverage within Turner to be like, I turned this company around, now can we get some investments in? And, they were paying Jack what they were paying him, and he was basically cutting a lot of guys that had decent contracts. And they couldn't agree on a new deal. Now, he was still in WCW when the ECW match happened. He was, in fact, one half of the tag team champions.
I guess the idea was, ECW was on its way up. It had this hardcore style. It was starting to get this buzz. And was it that Foley just wanted to be a part of it, that he had the idea to go wrestle Sabu?
No. WCW was entering into something of a working relationship with Paulie and ECW for a little bit. They were going to do some cross-promotional angles. It didn't really go that far, but the obvious crossover match for the hardcore wrestling fan, both fan of the hardcore style and big wrestling fan, was the wildest wrestler on the independent circuit, which was Sabu, versus kind of the established wildest guy in the major leagues, which was Cactus Jack.
Evan, what did you think of Sabu?
My first thought was that he was like a Street Fighter character. Come to life. Just in term, like his moves totally, like he did a jump kick at one point that was like a straight up Ryu jump.
When he did
kick.
like the 3 enziguris in a row at the beginning.
Yeah, he was. I guess it seemed like they were talking about him as if he had a reputation for doing crazy stuff. Oh, is he a racist character? I couldn't tell that.
No, he's well, he himself is from Michigan, but no, he's an Indian guy. His father was a wrestler named the Sheik, who was very famous in the blood and guts style.
Still
in the
a
60s
racist
and 70s
caricature,
for many years.
though. The Sheik.
Yeah, maybe a racist caricature, but he at least would be the ethnicity that they were talking about. So I would leave it up to him to decide if he wanted to play that character or not.
Definitely some Orientalism going on in the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely some Orientalism.
Low bar in '94. Also, I'm going to say at one point they're describing Cactus Jack, and they do the whole what sounds like a thing that they had used to describe him before, which is that he's like suicidal, homicidal,
genocidal. That's Sabu.
That's Sabu. Okay, that genocidal is very ambitious for a wrestler. Like suicidal, homicidal. I get it. Like genocide. Like, are you gonna is he gonna power bomb like millions of people?
That was the kind of like extreme phrase that was really popular at that time.
It's so 90s edgy. This whole thing is so 90s
Dude,
edgy,
when
man.
he in the promo at the end with Paulie where he drops like the O.J. Simpson trial for some reason as a reference. And Cactus Jack being like,
because it was happening at the time.
Yeah, oh, maybe. Yeah, he's like, I lost the title of Jack Kevorkian's favorite wrestler to Sabu. And that's really unfair to Jack Kevorkian. He was a euthanasia doctor. Like, they talk about him like he was some madman.
At the time, I mean, no, I remember him as like a character in pop culture. They called him Dr. Death.
Yeah.
And all this. And I did not know, in my head, he was like a serial killer or something. And it wasn't until like, my like 20s that I read an article talking about him where I was like, oh, wait, that's what this guy's deal was? I thought they made him out to be a serial killer. And he actually does a thing that I agree with.
Well, yeah, that was the fucking anti-euthanasia movement, demonizing him. But yeah, so Sabu... When I first learned about Sabu, it was from reading wrestling magazines. And I would see pictures of him, and they would describe him as this crazy dude. I remember one picture in the back of PWI that was Sabu just moonsaulting onto a table by himself. Because he would do that. After his matches, win, lose, or draw, he would set up a table and just flip himself through it. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever.
You got the feeling that was just a thing that he did like at his house when he was by himself.
Well, right, exactly. He managed to keep that kind of mystique up about himself where you think like, well, what's really wrong with this guy? Like, even if the matches may be predetermined, like, what's this guy's crazy deal?
Look, in the words of some of the finest musicians of our era, I'll Sabu your mama through a coffee table.
It's a line from an ICP song, I believe.
Yes.
There you go.
What is a juggalo?
Well,
a juggalo will Sabu your mama through a coffee table. That's what.
He comes out in chains with a 7-foot handler, 911. And he has to like release him.
911 was one of Heyman's finest creations. He got 911 so over, doing nothing but occasionally choke slamming people. As soon as one of the major leagues signed 911, you could tell he couldn't wrestle a lick. He was terrible.
Who was he anywhere else?
He went to WCW and they called him Big Al. He would talk for a while in ECW that he wanted a match with the Giant, with the Big Show, to fight choke slams against each other. He finally had that match. It was a 1.5-minute squash for the Big Show. And he was just exposed.
Yeah, in ECW, whenever someone was in the ring who they didn't like, the crowd would just chant for 911. And he would almost always come out and choke slam the fuck out of them. And that was it.
I have a technical question that came up in this match. Do you want to land differently, whether you're in the ring or you're landing on concrete? Like, is there a difference in your technique?
You kind of do. In the ring will absorb some of your impact, which is why you're taught like flat back bumps and so on, as much of your body as possible on it. With a completely unforgiving concrete, you really want to try and crumple. You really, really want to try and roll or crumple more so that there's not the splat fall that isn't giving you anything back.
Crumpling.
As in, like, you land maybe on your feet or your hands and slow yourself down a little bit.
Damn.
They do some crazy fucking
technique.
spots in this match. Sabu's ridiculous moonsault
Nothing
over
but.
the guardrail onto Jack on the table, where he pretty clearly conked his head on the guardrail on the way down. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah, in general, man, like, just the degree of head trauma going on. Like, same thing, like, every time a chair has come up in any of these matches and they hit someone with it, I'm like, oh, man, like, you used to just fucking hit a guy with a chair in the head. Like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Foley has short-term memory problems.
They say his mental state has improved a little bit today than it was a few years ago. He's been very aggressively trying to fix it because he wasn't doing too well a little while back. And but there have been promising treatments. There have been promising techniques. The human brain is an incredible organ that we still are continuing to study. But yeah, this is why most wrestling you see now, they've stopped doing that. But right, if you watch a certain style of wrestling, especially in the 90s as it started to ramp up, a lot of guys just wailed on each other in the face. People would give Hulk Hogan crap because his chair shots looked like they didn't have a lot of mustard behind him. But that's because he was working them. He would put his arms all the way above his head, extend the chair up, and then kind of let it fall. And it would still hit you in the head, but he wasn't swinging it like a baseball bat for your temple. It just made the sound and you didn't get a concussion.
Did you notice, Evan, when Foley hit Sabu with the frying pan that he grabbed out of the crowd?
Yeah, and then he hit himself with the frying pan a whole bunch.
Right.
Which that was when I wrote, oh, this is so 90s edgy, because he was so I'm damaged inside. Oh, I'm going to hit myself with the pan. Oh, I'm crazy, bro. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You got to remember, this was 94 before people would say that with sarcasm.
Sabu leg drops him through the table and Cactus laughs. He's like, ha ha ha.
Right.
I enjoyed that.
Well, this was the appeal of ECW. It was very much of the culture at the time. ECW peaked artistically way before it peaked commercially. Tell me if you've heard that story before.
Including, very much of the time, including, as Katie already mentioned, Paul E.'s ridiculously large 90s cell phone that he smashes over Foley's head for Sabu to win the match at the end.
Right, he started carrying that cell phone as a manager character several years before this, when the idea was, well, he was a rich yuppie from New York, so he'd have a cell phone, and he'd have it just in his hand so you could see it. And of course, it was giant like a brick, so he could hit his opponents, hit his managers, the guys who he managed opponents in the head with them, and it would knock them out because it was a gigantic brick.
You used to be able to kill somebody with a cell phone. In fact, there were a lot of murders on the set of Saved by the Bell.
I think that's a defect of our modern cell phones, is that they cannot be used as weapons.
Well, yeah. Now you have to download the Taser app and then download a mod for it so you can turn it up way higher than it's supposed to be.
I have the knife app.
That's a good one.
So one last thing that's notable about this match that Foley talked about in his book, I actually picked this one as the bad match when we originally put this together, though I think the Vader match is definitely the bad match now. But Foley thought that this was somewhat of a creative failure because his original plan for the match was based on the novel of Mice and Men, Steinbeck, I think. Have you ever read it, Evan?
Yeah, I believe so.
I have read it, yeah.
I haven't,
like-
but apparently there's a character who just takes a beating and doesn't fight back, and you sort of sympathize with him because of that.
Oh yeah, well that's the whole. I mean, I read this book in middle school, but it's a I mean, yeah, the whole book is just a guy and his friend who's a simple giant. And then his friend accidentally hurts a bunch of people, but doesn't. I don't know. He kills a rabbit at the end. This is a classic of American literature that
it's a deep and heavy story. If you're not
Yeah.
up for the book, there was a great movie adaptation starring Burgess Meredith, I believe, in the 60s. Of Mice and Men. Crazy, great story. Yeah, American literature classic, of course.
So Cactus, the idea was that he would gain sympathy by not fighting back the whole beginning of the match, but the ECW crowd really wasn't down for that. and they didn't get behind him at all. And as we've seen in like the Daniel Bryan Brock Lesnar match, not fighting back at all doesn't get you sympathy. Fighting back and continually being beaten down and not being able to overcome the adversity, that gets you sympathy. But if you don't fight back at all, the crowd loses interest. Eventually, he did start fighting back, and the crowd got into it, though.
Oh, yeah, the ECW crowd just wanted wall-to-wall mayhem. They weren't tired of that yet.
So they brawl a whole bunch after the match, which is fun. Sabu flips onto everybody. They brawl to the back. And then there are these promos afterwards. And one other thing this match is really notable for is the fact that Foley spits on the tag team championship belt in his promo, which did not get him a lot of love in the WCW locker room or from the office. He's basically saying, like, fuck WCW. They're not hardcore. ECW is hardcore. This is where I belong. And sure enough, they fired him. And he was free to do his hardcore shit.
Yeah, it became a major turning point in his career leaving WCW. The WCW didn't recognize his talent. They didn't know what to do with him. He needed to take what some would see as a step back into the independent circuit, into, touring Japan, which we'll talk about, and into going on to this fringe TV show ECW to have a rebirth. A lot of people ended up doing that exact same thing. Steve Austin did that. He was in WCW kind of going nowhere and then had a short stint in ECW before Vince signed him and he went on. And it really helped bring out, the creativity that he had within himself. And yeah, that's kind of what this was the catalyst for, because he went back to WCW and they're like, how come you spit on the belt, Jack? We wanted you to help them out a little bit, not tell everybody how crappy we are.
So this brings us to the fucking King of the Deathmatch tournament from IWA Japan, August 15th, 1995. It's a whole fucking deathmatch tournament. There were 8 people in it, 3 rounds. It gets to the final, and it's Cactus Jack and 50-year-old Terry Funk, a guy who was a top star for the NWA in the 70s, who is
60s into the 70s,
who is still fucking doing it, and not just still fucking doing it, but now pioneering this insanely violent deathmatch style. So they get to this match after a whole night of people seeing the most brutal death matches. They must have an even more brutal death match. And it's one
Funk's costume is like already darkened with the blood of the rest of the night.
Yeah, they're already so dirty.
He has a bloody bandage around his head already. And when this match starts.
So, Evan, I'm going to ask you in just a second because I want your thoughts on this match before we really get into it. But before I ask you what you thought of it, I want to go over a little bit of context just for the listeners. Like, this was the tape trader match for a few years. You'd see ads for it in magazines. Like, do you want to see the craziest shit you've ever seen? Check out Cactus Jack and Terry Funk and the King of the Deathmatch tournament with the whole tournament. And it would be fans that are used to seeing, like, the milquetoast barely has an identity WWF product of 94-95 where they were still trying to figure out what was happening, and the WCW product, which was now Hogan Light because Hogan had joined WCW. And then so you see ads in this magazine for like hardcore crazy stuff. Once again, think of this in the context of 94-95 when lots of people were turning their backs on what was mainstream 5 or 6 years before that and trying to find the more gritty stuff.
Was stuff like this not happening in Philadelphia at the same time?
No. ECW was there,
really?
but nothing to this extent had happened.
To some, like, they had already had the Taipei death match with Axl Rotten and Ian Rotten fighting with their... They taped their fists up and put glue and then covered it in broken glass and shit. Like, they were doing shit.
What the fuck? Just what the fuck?
Yeah, right. No, what the fuck? No, ECW was already imitating the... Japanese deathmatch style. What this tournament was, which had already been going on for a couple of years, this tournament was the apex of that entire style at the time.
Now, Terry Funk was a legend not only in America, but in Japan. He had toured Japan extensively. The way wrestling is in Japan is it's not necessarily an every week, every night thing, but there are like tours for several weeks, and then the guys get a week or two off. And it would be like, on this tour, we've signed X and Y Gaijin. And Terry Funk was on a lot of tours. He also almost never lost to anybody while he was in Japan. The fact that he did the job for Foley here was a huge deal in Japan and around the wrestling world. It was Terry Funk endorsing this guy as the next guy like him.
So let's just also describe.
Was Terry Funk was Terry Funk doing this kind of crazy hardcore shit at this age as a result of desperation, or like as a result of him as a wrestler being like, this is what I'm going to do with my career now? Like,
more
I'm
the
going in
second
this
one.
direction.
You know, he was a big success his entire career as like mostly a technical wrestler for decades.
He was always a crazy
he
guy.
had felt.
He always had the character
Yeah.
of kind of a crazy guy, but his style was more technical.
He saw that this was the style going forward that the kids were into, and he felt as the Texas Longhorn crazy guy, he could do it. Plus,
It was the cutting edge creatively for wrestling at the time.
yeah, it was. It was like if death metal got real big, and you're used to listening to hair metal, that was kind of the analog that I can come up with. So it wasn't out of desperation. He knew that was where the cusp was, and it lengthened his career into his 60s because he was able to shift like that. And not a lot of guys did, and not a lot of guys could.
Yeah. Even in the late 90s, he was doing, for the time, relatively hardcore shit with like Ric Flair, their I Quit match, which we should watch it when we do a Flair episode.
Maybe.
But yeah, like what's really brilliant about, so first of all, the setup of the match. The ropes are made of barbed wire. There are boards covered in barbed wire and C4 explosives in each corner. And after 10 minutes, the whole ring is supposed to explode.
Supposed
to, right.
Yeah.
That's the big... Evan, did you watch the version of this match with Foley reading from his book over it?
Yes, the one that was mixed incredibly poorly, so that Foley's narration was exactly the same volume as the audio of the video at all times.
Oh no!
Yes.
Oh, I found it. I thought that at the beginning when like their theme music was playing, but I thought for most of the match you could hear him pretty well.
Oh, that was not my experience of it.
Nah, I watched the other version with like commentary years in post
Fucking
by Dave
Prazak.
Prazak, but I know what Foley said in his book.
So, well, I mean, the great thing about it is there's this huge dud. Like, they smash through the fucking C4 boards. They explode all over them fairly safely. Foley actually misses one of the explosions because he, like, rolls through at one point. But, you know...
It's not actual C4.
Oh, it
right?
is.
That's like something else.
I don't know if it's actually C4 per se, but it's actual explosions. The second time Foley was thrown into a board, he got the full force of it, and he got second-degree burns on his arm. He explains in his book that on the way back...
In the part where he's reading from his book, or in, the version I watched where he's reading from the book, he talks about going to his wife... going to see his wife, and his wife's like, do you smell like something weird and burning? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then she's like, no, I definitely smell. Like, was somebody smoking next to you on the plane here? And then he's like, it's actually my own flesh.
Yeah. He took some pictures of it later. It looked crazy. But there was real explosions, real explosives, and they put more in before the match started because Terry Funk didn't think there was enough.
And they should have put more into the exploding ring because, like, Foley's like, oh, I'm going to get out of the ring. The ring's going to explode with Terry Funk in it, and then he's going to kick out, and it's going to be like, oh, shit, Terry Funk kicked out of the exploding ring. But the fucking explosion is so cheap and underwhelming that they were like, oh, now we just need to do even more hardcore shit.
It looked like a shitty version of Kane's Pyro, and then Terry Funk's face just sells it. He looks around like, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, Terry Funk is like, I was supposed to get blown up here, guys. That's not good enough.
So instead he's like, all right, let's just do a suplex directly onto the C4 board. And that's when they both get the really horrible burns. Then Cactus takes a ladder and slams it into Funk's head as hard as he can, totally fucking Funk up for the rest of the match, which is what leads to the really weird finish where Foley's on top of the ladder and Funk just kind of stumbles into it accidentally, knocking Foley off the ladder into the barbed wire, which like cuts him up really bad. And then Funk just collapses and Foley pins him. And that's the end of the match.
Yeah, it's not necessarily an unrealistic finish, but it was a bit anticlimactic. The main reason that we're watching this match is because of how notable it was. As how you put it, Ben, this was the apex of that style of hardcore. And like, you know, this isn't the kind of thing that even if you watch it, you'd want to see it all the time, at least not for me. It's like I see it as this oddity or as a moment in time in wrestling where the art form itself was struggling to find a new identity, and this was one of the offshoots.
One other...
And I will say I was more interested in this match, A, than the other matches, and B, even like this got me a little more than this kind of match I guess normally would, or at least a little bit of the hardcore style I've seen so far. Like I could tell, especially at the point where his face is entirely covered in his own blood.
Ooh, the crimson mask is what they say in wrestling.
I mean,
the crimson mask.
You know, it's not necessarily my thing, but I could definitely recognize that it was pretty interesting.
What cracks me up about this match, and specifically Terry Funk in these hardcore matches, is they're falling through these explosions, they're falling through the barbed wire, all this shit, and then to win the match, he'll put on a wrestling hold, like his spinning toe hold or a butterfly suplex. It's like, well, that's the thing that's going to put them down after the fucking explosions?
Well, and the fans react to it because they remember him as this wrestler. Yeah, Evan, Terry Funk very famously retired for the first time in Japan in 1980. He has since retired dozens of times since.
It is a running joke.
And his finishing move is the spinning toe hold, which is like the beginning of a figure four. Like, we see it as like half of a move even. And that's what he's putting on after the explosions in order to put down his opponent. It's this great throwback because everyone remembers from the fucking 60s and 70s, that's the move he used to win the NWA title. So you can also see like how in the minds of the fans, the history and adds significance to moves that makes them more powerful for having that history than they would appear just on the face of it. Another thing I wanted to talk about was Foley suplexing objects onto his opponents, which he was known for. He does it with a table in the Sabu match. He does it with a ladder with Terry Funk.
Oh,
that's a great combination of like hardcore garbage wrestling and like wrestling technique. Like, yeah, I'm going to suplex the ladder.
That reminds me very specifically. Foley used all of these objects. This was before like conventional wrestling started using like ladders and tables very often. Now, when you see them pull out a table, you know about where they're going to place it and what they're going to do with it. We know all the configurations for it. We didn't know back then. It was just a wild man throwing things, especially the ladder. Like, you get the ladder out now and you think, is he going to jump off it? Are they going to do the spinning thing? No, he's just going to hit Terry with it because it's a big metal thing. Eventually, he did like jump off it to do his elbow.
Also, they're not the mass-produced, like processed WWE objects that you know are going to break in a certain way and this and that. It was whatever fucking table or ladder they could find, which made them a lot more dangerous. All right, Evan.
We're getting towards the end.
Yeah,
here.
so give us your final thoughts about Cactus Jack.
Oh man, I could watch promos all day of Cactus Jack.
And there will be more.
I'm excited to see more of Foley's promo work in general. I'm excited to see how all the characters relate to each other. It feels like something. This more than anything else that we've covered so far feels like a thing that maybe you had to be there for. Not to say that you can't. Not to say that I can't appreciate it or anything like that. But it feels like at the time, man, it must have been really, really different and really mind blowing.
Yeah, and I think even
as
for
much as it doesn't really captivate me very much right now.
I mean, I think it's also true for me and Doc. Like by the time we were actually watching this stuff, it was already kind of passé because we didn't get to see it. We heard about it when we were younger, and it created this legend.
Yeah, you'd read about it in the magazines.
Yeah. By the time you actually see it, it's like, yeah. I mean, especially when we get to the even more hardcore stuff, it's disturbing. It's not really pleasant to watch. It's kind of cool to know that it happened, and Foley has a lot of respect, and he has his own legend largely because he went through this shit. But no, I mean, there's a reason why we were big fans of Ring of Honor in the early 2000s and not Combat Zone Wrestling.
Right, exactly. And there is also something to be said about the enjoyment of like hearing crazy stories about like Gigi Allen versus actually being at a club where a guy's on stage like taking a dump on stage.
And then all of a sudden it smells like poop.
Yeah, and nobody wants that. But you can read the legend and think, oh, that was crazy, you know?
Well, it's much like Gigi Allen, like somebody had to do it, right? Somebody had to bring it to its logical conclusion, because watching this is like, you know, like I don't, you know, I talk about how I don't really like MMA and stuff like that just because I don't really care for blood sport. Like I don't really need to see people beat the shit out of each other, even if it's like an athletic competition at the same time. And even if they are personally choosing to do it, like, you know, have at it, you can enjoy yourself, but it's not something I like. There is something extra fucked up to me about people doing the performative theater that is wrestling, but in a way, but like with fucking explosives and shit. And it's not even like the, you know, we watched the Kenny Omega hardcore match that clearly involved some pain, but that was like, at least that was like breakaway glass and like, you know, the mousetraps.
I have a match.
Yeah, exactly. Like there.
Yeah, I have a match planned for like the third premium of this series that I haven't even told Doc about yet because I just watched it the other night. That's going to problematize this whole thing for you a little bit more, I think, Evan, because it is absolutely spectacular, but it is fucking disturbingly violent at the same time. So, wait for that.
Cool.
Does it involve the ocean?
No, all landlocked wrestling in this case.
I think that in the 90s, it also makes sense that, because I've just been thinking about, you know, we're recording this on April 1st, and, you know, given the situation that we're in, I was thinking about how, like, it's weird that the mid-90s was, like, the peak of America, largely. It's weird that it was just, like, we had like the you know, crime wave that had been going since the 70s, like was the violent crime statistics had started to drop, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and like it was just weird that at the time when technically like America was unchallenged and just purely 100% on the rise, people were like, let's fucking watch guys do barbed wire matches and then listen to Korn.
Nietzsche talks about this because he says the height of Greek tragedy came, of Attic tragedy, particularly done in Athens, came when Athens was flourishing, when it was at its highest point as a society. Then when things started to go downhill in real life, that's when comedy started to become really popular. And it seems like this thing where a society's art actually often reflects the very opposite of the reality that they're facing. If things are super safe and happy in real life, well, what we crave is the fucking disastrous and calamitous and hardcore and violent in our art. And then when things are actually really horrible and hardcore and violent in our lives, then we crave art that makes us feel better about things. That's, you know, a little bit more safe.
I always think about Lords of Chaos, which I actually still have not seen the movie, but you know, reading the book about the 90s black metal scene in Norway, the original black metal guys who like murdered each other and were generally awful people. One of their big things was they were like, life is too good now. They were like, oh, they were all like upper middle class kids who
in Norway,
in a country with an amazing social safety net, and like had the ability to just like open a record store if they wanted to, and this kind of shit. And they were just like, it's fucking too good.
Yeah, fuck humans. Our psychology is fucked.
We're so terrible.
Oh, completely. I mean, it makes sense if you think about it, only because you have all the same human instincts in your own head. And that's you're spot on there. You know, putting this in context is so important. And you're right, you did have to kind of be there. I think some of the future stuff we're going to watch from Foley, some of his more mainstream later stuff in like the WWE, is going to ring a little, I don't know, a little more timeless, I think. Some of it. We'll find out.
We will find out.
I'm looking forward to it.
On that note, we should probably wrap.
Yes. This has been Contesting Wrestling. If you enjoyed today's episode, and you should first check out all of our previous episodes, and if you really like it, you should subscribe to our Patreon for $5 a month. You will get one bonus episode every week. They're usually sort of a complement to our main feed episodes. We are hopefully going to be bringing more cool stuff to you this week, or not this week, in general, and on the Patreon as we figure stuff out. And yeah, get ready for part 2 of Mick Foley next week. Follow us on Twitter at ContestingW. Let us know how you feel about things. Yeah, my name is Evan Burke. I almost said my name has been Evan Burke, but it continues
also
to
true.
be that.
It's like, what did Mitch Hedberg once say? I used to do drugs. I still do, but I used to too.
Yep.
Yeah. R.I.P. Mitch.
R.I.P. Mitch.
Thank you so much, everybody. This has been Contesting Wrestling. We love you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.